Okay, so section B then. The main event, I guess, of the whole year. One of the most dramatic moments in world history, I guess, in the 20th century. I mean, it really beggars belief. You can see some images here, or representations of images here, apart from this photo. But the Bolsheviks seizing power now, so taking power. How did it happen? What was the story? Okay. Well, as we saw, the MRC was formed. Trotsky reckons that 3/4 of it was already done just by forming it. Well, the 24th of October, they begin the coup. So left out, Lenin makes his way to the Smolny Institute that we saw before at the end of section A. Which used to be, by the way, a finishing school for girls, as we can see here. So again, very incongruous, kind of almost hilarious that a place that used to be used to create the sort of middle or upper class women of Russia would go on to be the place where the Bolsheviks took power. But anyway, Lenin makes his way to the Smolny Institute. He can't stay out of it. Again, similar to when he was in Finland, it's just too important to him. He needs to sort of have his hand on the tiller of the boat, shall we say? And he's disguised once again. Many of the other parties don't even know that he's there. And he wants to make sure that the MRC is going and actually carrying this out now, because he's been left out, as we've said. Whilst the MRC is going to all of these strategic places, so as we know, the railway stations, the telegraph offices, the post offices, the banks, as we can see here, armed men. This is the evening of the 24th. The Bolsheviks have the nerve to announce to the other parties in the Soviet there at a meeting that Kerensky had already been overthrown, and then Lenin speaks and tells them that the revolution has happened. Now, again, this is a lie, as we know. They hadn't taken power yet. Truly, or had they? Again, down to you on where you think power was really, when the Bolsheviks really got power. But the symbolic taking of the Winter Palace was still a day away. So, why did the Bolsheviks do this? Well, it allowed them to sort of not have to argue a case at the next day. There's going to be the Congress of Soviets. Sorry, I forgot to mention, obviously, that deliberately timed the taking of the Winter Palace with the Congress of Soviets so all of this could happen. Again, nothing was accidental here. Everything really very thoroughly thought through and intended. And so they could turn around to them at the next day and say, well, it's already happened, so you've got nothing to argue against, even though there was something to argue against. Was this the turning point? And as we can see here, I love this image. We've got a sort of like a Red Guard or Bolshevik members. We've got lots of different types of people. Sort of traditional sort of peasant-looking gentlemen here, and they don't look. They don't seem like professional soldiers, do they? I mean, we've got a mixture. Obviously, we've got soldiers here, but I'd say a ragtag collection of fighters, but a fighting force nonetheless. And the Red Guard, who will go on to be, well, as we already know, yeah. And just another image here again of the sort of military element to the Bolsheviks party through the soldiers, which again will prove to be very, very important when you come to look at well, actually, a lot of later Bolshevik policy, most of it is informed by sort of a military ethic or appealing to the soldiers, especially under Stalin. So the day after, again, the nerve of the of these people, and despite the fact they still haven't actually taken power yet, well, again, or have they? But so they still haven't taken the Winter Palace, but they scatter, they print these leaflets, they scatter them all over Petrograd in the back, climb into the backs of cars, which are armed, with armed to defend them, and drop these, litter them all round Petrograd, telling everybody the provisional government has been overthrown, that the state power has gone solely into the hands of the Petrograd Soviet, and that importantly they claim that it was the MRC which was responsible for this. Robert Service claims that by doing this, again, Lenin was the person that asked for this to happen, apparently, but deliberately trying to infuriate the Mensheviks and the SRs, by saying that the MRC has already essentially become a government, essentially, which obviously just wasn't true. Okay, so the big evening then. So this evening of October the 25th, seminal in Russia's history. It's the evening of the storming of the Winter Palace and also the second All-Russian Congress of Soviets. As we now know, this wasn't a storming. Oh, pardon me. So it wasn't, as we can see here, but that's how it was presented. There's a force of maybe 10 to 15,000. It seems like quite a lot in our terms, but of those, only a minority really made it inside the Winter Palace. The Kronstadt sailors there, famously with their ship, the Aurora, which is still docked now in St. Petersburg, it fired a blank at 9:40 p.m. Just so we know, the Congress did not start till 10:35 p.m. It had actually been stalled deliberately, so they could announce it at the same time. Kerensky had already fled. There were rumours that abounded that he had to dress up as a lady so that he wouldn't be seen. Whether that's true or not is not really fully known. But Kerensky had fled, knew what was going to happen. I guess after the MRC had already taken the key strategic points, and a few members of the provisional government left inside. They're arrested, and mostly it's soldiers wandering through, as we can see here in the bottom right, an empty palace, which must have been an incredibly interesting, eerie experience for these workers, these peasants, some of them, I guess, peasants, to be inside what was the seat of power under the Tsar and the Tsars for 300 years. Famously, so Sergei Eisenstein, who's one of the most, we saw his video with Potemkin, Battleship Potemkin. All of his films are, studied at film schools and key films in the history of cinema. He recreated the October Revolution in a trilogy of films, I think in early 1920s, and famously more damage was done to the Winter Palace in the filming of that film. As we can see here, this is one of the famous image or stills from that film. Yeah, more damage was done then than it was when the actual palace was taken anyway. And as it was made under so it must have been post 1924 these were made, but as it was made under Stalin, Trotsky was, even though Trotsky was the person that had organised all of this, that was the head of the MRC, straight away this kind of rewriting of history. Stalin removes Trotsky from his role. He's made to look like this shady character. So as you can see here again, this kind of image kind of glorifying the moment. You've got the figure here as if to sort of, it's the sailors and a mixture of sailors and soldiers. Ramshackle kind of palace, looks like it's fallen down. Obviously it was nothing quite like this, but so whilst that is happening back in the Smolny Institute, the various different parties there are there for the Second All-Russian Congress. And as we know, this was engineered by the Bolsheviks to essentially just be ceremonial. They knew what they were doing. Again, the images has Lenin at the front. This is him sort of announcing the government. Apparently, he was actually kept to the kind of in the background because the Bolsheviks didn't kind of want to give the game away. Apparently. So they let Kamenev and Zinoviev, again ironically the two that spoken against the insurrection, be the sort of face of the Bolshevik party on the stage as the leaders at this point. And yeah, I mean, it's amazing to think, isn't it? So 670 delegates there. They'd already passed a resolution to form a socialist government, and in the hour or so after that resolution had been passed, news comes in, and it is announced that the Winter Palace has been taken, that there has been an insurrection, and that the Bolsheviks essentially have made this all, as I said, just ceremonial, almost unnecessary. And it was engineered to make the other parties walk out. So Martov of the Mensheviks, the SRs, as we know, they walk out in protest. They're offended. They're shocked that it's actually happened. And Trotsky famously stands up as they're leaving, and he calls to them. He calls them miserable bankrupts, and and he tells them that they should go where they ought to go, into the dustbin of history. Which I think is quite incredible that Trotsky was aware of how historic this moment was, and I guess it kind of tells us that Trotsky knew that they'd secured power. Very, very telling. Some of the left SRs stayed behind, so some of those that had begun to be swayed towards the Bolsheviks. So obviously SRs had split. And this meant that because the left SRs had stayed, that there was enough of the people that were left to pass what would count as a majority. Very, very important as well. One of the Mensheviks, Sukhanov, whose memoirs are often referred to in this history, recognised, as Feiges points out, that it was only afterwards that the Mensheviks really understood that by walking out of that room, they had let that room, and therefore the future of the government come all under Bolshevik power, because there was no one else. There were no other policies there, or people to stand up for different policies or to make different cases, apart from within the Bolshevik Party itself. So the nail in the coffin for any Menshevik hopes or any other Socialist Party hopes is at 2 a.m. in the morning. Trotsky puts forward this motion condemning what he called the treacherous attempts of the Mensheviks and the SRs to undermine the Soviet. Again, he's kind of dressing this up here, but by this point, they knew that it was theirs for the taking. This gave a sort of Soviet stamp of approval, as Feiges says, to then allow the Bolsheviks to essentially do whatever they wanted, really, and that's what they do. So this is getting to the end now. I'll quickly rifle through these, but this is a rendering, a painting, Valentin Saratov. The moment that Lenin, obviously they'd had the idea to call the governments of Narkom, the Council of People's Commissars. So Sov is, as we often see, these three words put together. You've got Sov, which is Soviet Council, Narod, people or peoples, and Commissars. That was the name of a government that they'd settled on, and knew that they were going to announce. And so now Lenin comes out and announces in the very early hours of the morning that there would be a Bolshevik government. And as we can see here, kind of mixture. We've got sailors, we've got Stalin, we've got Bukharin, important figure. Yeah. In the grandeur of the Smolny Palace. So, what happens on the next day then? So we get this flurry, the last little bit of this section then. So we get the decree on land. Again, Lenin knew that this would be a historic. It's issued by... it abolishes private property, redistributes land among the peasantry. Again, they'd already been taking the land for themselves anyway, so essentially it was just an appeal to the peasants to try to take them, or give a sense of legitimacy to the Bolsheviks. But the only party that said that they would do that. As you will see later as well, the irony of this is actually that this, all it did was strengthen the Mir, really. So this sets up an actual opposition between the Bolsheviks and the peasantry, because the peasants have wanted the Mir for themselves since the 1861. They finally get it. So for them in the countryside, the government administration in Russia really hadn't been able to reach or penetrate into the countryside very well at all, as we know. And so for them, this allowed the peasants to finally get the land they wanted, and it actually just strengthened traditional life. So the peasants are now set on that course, on a traditional basis, which is later going to clash with the socialist, more utopian thought of the Bolsheviks, especially under Stalin. It's not until the 5-year plans in the mid-1920s that this clash happens, but just keep that in mind. Yeah. Lenin wanted this to sort of be demonstrative of what this new revolution, the revolution as they were trying to claim it was, this as the final most important step, and that the February Revolution wasn't that. And as we saw with the Feiji's readings, openly asks the peasantry to take lands from their previous masters. So they harness, again, they're very, very intelligent, very good at harnessing this revolutionary energy. Peasants and various people in the countrysides kind of revel in this almost human sense of retribution, at seeing these people that used to rule over them reduced to the streets, reduced to nothing, and the peasants getting what they want. So it's quite a violent time. Everything's bristling with energy and fear in the countryside. We also get the decree on peace, the two main decrees. Again, it called on all of those in the war to conclude an armistice, so to stop, based on sort of Marxist the internationalist outlook that Lenin had. Called for the immediate withdrawal from World War One. As we know with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, as we're going to look in the next part, that's actually a lot more difficult than it looks. It's very easy to say it, but how easy is it to do? That's why Feiji's calls this more an expression of hope than anything. But at this point, John Reed, who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World, he was an American journalist there, did say that the room was kind of full of this energy of almost people crying, a sort of sense of feeling, like a breath's been taken, I guess, with, this war that has been afflicting the nation for the previous 3 years. I mean, little do they know what's around the corner. But yeah. And the last one is the decree on the press, which comes 2 days after Sovnarkom has been announced. And we're going to look at who's in Sovnarkom in the next section, and as we know how they managed to keep power. Decree on the press then, so it's the first instance of censorship, despite the fact the Bolsheviks had campaigned for a policy of freedom for the press. So any organ of the press was liable to close if it incited any resistance to Sovnarkom. Apparently this was supposed to be temporary, but Robert Service thinks that Lenin didn't actually believe this because Lenin saw the principle of a free press as playing into the hands of the bourgeoisie. And again, these temporary measures, which turn out to not be temporary, you'll see a few more of those in the next section. But these 2 degrees especially are very, very important. This one more of a clue or a sign to the type of government that will emerge. So, some key questions, some key things to think about. As I said all the way through these 2 sections, what was the key moment on the Bolsheviks' path to power? Not just including actually in these sections, but beforehand. You know, is it the April Theses? Is it the Kerensky offensive in June? Is it the Kornilov affair, which gets them back in popularity? Is it the creation of the MRC? Is it Kerensky's decision to try and take the garrison out of Petrograd? Is it even Lenin's return? What if Lenin hadn't managed to make it back? And so that links to the second question here then, which is, what was ultimately the key factor? It's slightly different here, but it's easy to say that it was just all down to Lenin, and obviously he had an integral role, and potentially would not have been possible without his leadership. But was he the key factor? What about the role of Trotsky? What about the radicalization of the workers? Or was the key factor the policy failures of the Mensheviks and the SRs, so not being able to offer anything that appealed to the masses? Or was it indeed the failings of the provisional government? I mean, there's quite a compelling case for that one. Or was it many, many other things? I will leave it down to you. But that is the end of this section, and next week we're going to look at how did they stay in power.